When I was 20, I worked as a security guard for my mall during my summer break from college. The mall I worked at used to get a lot of people at all hours of the day, so I never really had any downtime since I always had an eye out for shoplifters and whatnot. Although sometimes I'd be stuck working the night shift, which would typically be the hours between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., and since the mall closes at 8, I'm almost always alone. The only times I've ever seen other people are the teenagers that come to either smoke or do more explicit activities, and I'd have to kick them out. I generally had to work the night shift once a month, and on the last Saturday of July, it was my turn once again. I clocked in like any normal night, and I began my patrol around the mall. Basically, I'd just drive the security car around, and every once in a while I'd check through the parking garages. But for the most part, I'd just park in the main parking lot, which had a view of each of the entrances, and I'd watch YouTube videos or something. I know, I should be paying attention to my surroundings since I'm a security guard, but for some context, the area I was in was pretty safe, and there never had been any reports of any crime going on at the mall, aside from some graffiti here and there. Anyways, I digress. This night was especially clear, and there was a full moon illuminating the entire area that I was parked in. At one point, I saw some old beat-up truck pull into the lot, but it was just a couple of teenagers coming to smoke, per the usual, and I just told them to leave. Another couple of hours go by, and there wasn't any more activity. The clock in my car read 2:45 a.m., and I started counting down the minutes until I could go home and sleep. I remember I went to lean my seat back, and I was looking at the moon, which was sitting right above the big Macy's sign on the side of the mall, when something caught my eye. I rubbed my eyes and sat up, scanning the roof. Then I saw it again. It looked like a figure crouching down, on the roof, but all I could see was a silhouette. Then I saw a second figure stand up and start walking. At this point, I was freaked out. How in the hell did these people get up there? I wasn't aware of any construction going on, but I couldn't rationalize how two random people managed to get on the roof. The mall was at least 100 feet tall, and I for sure would have noticed a ladder or something. I watched as they creeped along the edge, which was when I put my car into drive and started making my way around the perimeter, looking for anything out of place that would indicate how these figures got up there. After a few times circling the entire building, nothing seemed to be out of place, so I started looking through the parking garage. That was when I saw two bicycles parked by one of the entrances. I slowly went over to the doors, which were both locked. I was beyond perplexed. I knew it was my job to secure the mall, but I had no clue how I was going to catch these guys. I didn't want to waste any time before they robbed the place or vandalized it, so I decided to call the police as I waited by their bikes. Not even a minute later, I heard a commotion right above me. I'll try to describe the layout the best way that I can. The parking garage wasn't directly connected to the mall. There's about a 10-foot space between them. The stairwell of the parking garage, however, sits between the 10 feet of space of mall and garage. So as I looked up, I could see the two guys peering over the edge of the roof, looking down at where I was standing, and I just looked up at them and said, "You're fucked," trying to sound tough. That was when I saw how they managed to get on the roof. The top of the garage was open air, so they climbed on top of the stairwell and managed to use a rope to shimmy down and onto the other side and onto the roof. Pretty clever, honestly. But before they were able to get back over and get away, a police officer pulled up to where I was. I explained the situation as quickly as I could, and then he went up the stairs to where the guys would be climbing back over. I decided to go with him since I knew there were two people, and it was technically my job as well. We tried to stay as quiet as possible, and as we climbed the second half of the stairs, we saw them hop over, and the cops screamed for them to stop. However, both guys decided to run. They were both easily 6'2", and both wearing hoodies. The cop caught the slower one, and unfortunately the other guy was way faster than me because he left me in the dust. Thankfully though, he was caught by another cop who had just arrived on scene. The most bone-chilling part has yet to be told. They were obviously arrested for trespassing and running from the police, but the reason they had been on the roof in the first place is the most terrifying part. It was released that they had been looking for good places to shoot at people inside the mall, from the big skylight that overlooked the food court. Their plan was, once everyone evacuated outside, they would continue to shoot at them in the parking lot, and at the end of it all, they were going to take their own lives. It wasn't confirmed exactly what day they had planned on, but I find myself thinking about this a lot, because when I work inside, the main area I monitor is the food court. Now, it was never released whether or not they were part of a terrorist group or if they were just sick, but either way, I'm glad they were caught and put away forever. I'm a security guard at my local cemetery. The reason my town has security at their main cemetery is because my town is wealthy and the surrounding towns not so much. So a lot of times people sneak in at night with shovels to dig up and rob graves, hoping that these people are buried with their valuables. 9 times out of 10, it's some homeless person, and we'll catch them and immediately throw them out, sometimes literally. Other times, it'll just be a group of kids trying to have fun digging up dead bodies, if you would call it that. This night, however, was not a case of grave robbing. Before I delve into the story, I'll try to paint the picture for you a little bit. The cemetery is a solid 75 acres of land, not small by any means. To make it complicated, whoever designed the roadway system through must have drew a scribbly line on a piece of paper with absolutely no rhyme or reason at all. So a big part of my job was to help people during the day to find exactly where their loved ones were buried. I don't mind it. I enjoy the human interaction I get from it. Anyways, where I work primarily is a security office by the main entrance, and I'll monitor the several cameras around the place. It's technically closed at sundown, but if someone pulls in and they don't look too sketchy, I'll try to be cool and just tell them not to give me a reason to kick them out. Most of the time, it's just kids coming to hang out and do whatever they can't do at their house. Cough cough, smoking weed. Obviously, I keep a close eye on them, but usually I have a good intuition about who will be up to no good. On the particular shift in question, it was a night shift. I'd done my usual clocking in at 9 p.m. and prepared for the 8-hour shift to 5 a.m. I brewed an entire pot of coffee and sat at my desk with the security cameras. I'm big into solitaire, and that's what I do most nights. After about an hour, I got bored, and I went out and hopped on our golf cart and figured a quick spin through the graveyard would clear my head a little. Illuminated by the dinky little headlights, I cruised my way through the winding roadway, scanning around for anything out of place. After about 30 minutes, I was back at the start with everything seemingly normal. I thought, screw it, I'll take another lap. I was about halfway through when the path took a hairpin turn and immediately went uphill. As my lights pointed up as I took the hill, I thought I could make out something unusual with one of the older headstones. I stopped and grabbed my flashlight and went up to it. What I saw had me taken aback. The headstone was split in half. I don't mean it was just cracked. It was literally split perfectly down the middle. In the space in between, I could almost fit my finger. I can't believe I never noticed this before. The grave was from the late 1700s. I can't remember the exact date. I looked it up and down to see if there was anything that could have hit the headstone to split it like that, but the area was clear of any trees or rocks or any sort of debris. Even if something did hit it though, I doubt it would split it this perfectly. It was honestly too perfect to be a natural occurrence. I stood there for a minute, just scratching my head. Then, like someone flipped a switch, I felt the temperature drop at least 10 degrees as I felt the shiver run through my spine. My curiosity was quickly replaced by sheer terror and some urgent instinct to get as far from this grave as I possibly could. As I flew through the rest of the pathways, I swear I could feel a dozen sets of eyes watching me from every direction. Then, when I got back to the guard shack, the temperature had gone back to normal. As I walked back to the door, I realized how much I was shaking as I almost fell over. I hadn't ever felt fear the way I just felt it ever at this place. I had no way to explain it. I rushed to the computer to check the security tapes, but when I checked the camera for that area, it looked normal as usual. After a few minutes, I'd calmed down a lot more. I figured it had to have been about an hour since I had initially left, but when I checked the clock, my jaw hit the floor. I expected it to be about 11:30, but somehow it ended up being 4:17 a.m. instead. This was impossible. Was I really outside for 5 hours? I remembered that our cameras saved up to 48 hours of footage before overwriting, so I started sifting through all the clips of me. Sure enough, after an hour I had made my second lap around, and I saw myself stop and get off the golf cart. I watched myself walk over, and that was when I realized something. The blood drained from my face as I watched myself stare at an empty spot on the ground. There was no gravestone. How was this possible? My heart was racing as I skipped to an hour later of the clip. I saw myself still standing there, motionless, like someone had just hit the pause button on me. It must have been a glitch in the camera. There was no way. I rewinded and watched it from where I visibly shivered from that sudden drop in temperature, and that was when I froze in place. That same feeling of terror began to creep back in. I held the mouse cursor over the 2-hour mark, 3-hour mark, 4-hour mark. I hadn't moved. I kept watching until eventually I just snapped out of it and ran back to the cart and drove back. I pulled out my flash drive and saved all of this. My heart sank as I realized I had just encountered something seemingly paranormal. This wasn't something cool like the lights flickering or a door closing on its own. This just seemed sinister. I just locked the door to the shack and stared at the ground for the last 15 minutes of my shift. My alarm went off, signaling 5 a.m., and I could not have been happier to go home. During my next shift, I had explained everything to my boss, and I showed him the flash drive video. He seemed just as freaked out as me, and wanted to go see where the headstone supposedly was. When we pulled around that hairpin turn, sure enough there was no split in two gravestone. To this day, I cannot explain this. It easily was the most horrifying experience of my life, and I will probably die not knowing what happened to me. If anyone has any ideas whatsoever, please let me know. I work at a distribution center as a stalker. I work different hours, but occasionally I'll work late into the night if we get a big shipment of materials to stock. God, I hated working late. I would usually get scheduled with this one other guy, Dev, that I did not get along with. It was always sly remarks he'd make about my weight, stuff like that. I'm ashamed to say it's gotten to the point where we've had to be separated from almost fighting. So, as to why my manager would make us work together all night is beyond me. I'm guessing as some sort of punishment for acting out to each other, who knows. Anyways, we had just gotten a big shipment of a bunch of different items, so we had to work together and move them with a forklift to their designated sections of the warehouse and log it in the inventory and all this other boring stuff. Since I was in fact a larger fellow, I usually was the guy working the forklift instead of walking and guiding. This time around was no different. We had 8 loading docks absolutely full of pallets of different junk for our Walmart stores. We began the treacherous task of consolidating each pallet to its respective location. Along the way, Dev and I did our usual bickering. He was whining that I was going too slow, how I wasn't loading the pallets properly. He just went on and on. We were in an aisle of the warehouse that was in the back corner, near where all the offices were. Each office had a window looking into the warehouse, but all of them had blinds that were closed. And it being early midnight, every light should have been off in the offices, although I noticed one was on by where the receptionist worked. In the moment, I thought nothing of it, as it wasn't really my problem. I assumed that maybe someone forgot to turn it off or something. About an hour later, I was bringing another pallet down that same aisle. This time, every office light was off, including the receptionist area, which was previously just on. Again, maybe someone had forgotten something and came back inside to get it. At this time, I still didn't see it as a problem. Not even 5 minutes later, As we headed up that aisle next to the offices, I swear I saw the blinds move ever so slightly. I pointed this out to Dev, and we both looked closer. Nothing. He called me an idiot, and we went back to work. Later in the night, about a couple hours had passed, and we had finished up stalking everything. I had completely forgotten about the weird stuff I saw earlier in the night until we went to clock out. Our punch clock is in an area behind the reception desk, which we hadn't been to since 9 a.m. that morning. Before I even saw, I heard Dev mutter, "What is that?" I round the corner, and all I see is this dark figure peering around the doorway looking back at us with this disgusting smiling mask half covered by the door. I screamed out of shock and took a solid 10 steps back as this guy just stared at us. Who the hell are you?" I stammered. I tried to sound tough, but the inflection in my voice was a dead giveaway that I was scared shitless. He just laughed this raspy laugh and stepped back into the office area. Unlike me, Dev just seemed pretty annoyed by this and followed after him, telling him he's calling the cops. Maybe 10 seconds after he goes in, the light flicks on, and I can hear him screaming bloody murder, and he comes back charging into the warehouse like a bat out of hell, screaming at me to get out of the building immediately. I had never felt such intense fear in my life. I had no idea what Dev could have seen that would make him freak out and run like that, and I wasn't about to find out. I ran as fast as my fat ass could move in the direction of the side exit. I heard some sort of laugh cackling coming from behind me, but I didn't have it in me to turn around. By the time I got outside, Dev was already in his car, and he drove up to me and told me to get in, that we had no time to waste. He peeled out like a madman, and now that we were safe, I out of breath asked him what in the hell he saw. What he told me not only confused me, but sent shivers down my spine. When he turned the light on, he saw at least 6 figures, all sitting in office chairs with those horrifying masks, all staring at him. To make things more ominous, they all had some sort of weapon/tool in their hands. One guy had branch clippers, one guy had a shovel, another had a pickaxe, etc. There was also some big red candle in front of one guy, which must have just been extinguished because he noted that he could smell the smoke from it as he walked in. He said it almost seemed like some sort of weird cult meeting, which made no sense. Why would they choose some random reception office in a distribution center? It just didn't add up. My loose theory is that they were there to rob the place. What I can't explain is the masks, weapons, or the candle. That's something I'll always wonder. And yes, we did call the police. Once they showed up, they found no traces of the guys, and nothing seemed out of place. Unfortunately, the offices don't have security cameras, only the warehouse, so there wasn't really any proof of them being there except for when that one guy briefly stood in the doorway. Regardless, nothing came of this story. I wish there was some big search for the guys and that they were caught and brought to justice, but no, it was just completely forgotten about. To be honest though, part of me is glad this has happened, because my manager promised me I wouldn't ever have to work a night shift again, although it doesn't take away from the fact that I could have been slaughtered that night. The story I'm about to tell is one of the most horrifying nights of my life, and since then I refuse to work any night shift jobs ever again. For some background, I'm a 32-year-old male, and I worked at a security guard agency based in Texas. I've worked at several different places ranging from malls to hospitals to car dealerships, you name it. This particular job I had was a 6-month-long detail at this nuclear power plant out in East Bumfuck. I don't know much about what they were doing. All I know is that there was a lot of valuable equipment and resources that could be stolen or damaged. It was a Monday night. I was dreading this shift all week. 5 p.m. to 5 a.m. The only good news was that I would be off for the next 8 days. I just had to get through this shift. Don't get me wrong, I love being a security guard. It's just jobs like this where nothing goes on. It's so mind-numbingly boring that I could easily sleep through the entire shift. So at 4:50, I rolled up in my truck and clocked in. Most of the construction had ended for the day, so I already was basically alone. All that I was required to do was just sit in the general contractor's trailer and sit there for 12 hours. After the first 8 hours, I wanted to send my head through the wall. Like I expected, absolutely nothing had happened. I was on Tinder, swiping through the bland women this part of Texas had to offer, when I heard the sound of what I assumed was rocks hitting metal. Like someone was pelting metal with graveled rocks. I instantly peered out the window and saw nothing. I knew someone was there. My heart went from 0 to 60 in about 2 seconds. Like I said earlier, I'm out in the middle of nowhere. The fact I even had cell service was a miracle. And for someone to be out there at 1 o'clock in the morning would be nothing short of bad news. I opened the door and slowly walked down and out towards where I heard the sound. I had my flashlight in hand and my nightstick ready to beat anyone to a pulp if I had to. I was absolutely terrified. There were like 10 different excavators and backhoes parked together, and it would have been very easy for someone to be hiding behind or under one of them. I tried to be as quiet as possible as I crept around each machine, expecting someone to jump out at any second. Although outside the excavators, it was complete darkness. I shined my light into the night, and to my absolute horror, the flashlight beam revealed a figure wearing a green hoodie with the hood up, standing with his back to me. I tried to sound intimidating, but I could hear the shake in my voice. "Hey, you need to leave now. This is private property." No reaction. I slowly approached him. I say him because there's no way a woman had shoulders that broad. Once again, I yelled out, "You need to leave now." They had not moved a muscle since I first shined the light on them. My hands were shaking almost uncontrollably as I went to put my hand on his shoulder, and when I did, it was cold and solid, and my fear amplified when it turned out to be a mannequin with this awful smile drawn on its face. I felt myself go pale as I got this gut-wrenching feeling of dread. I suddenly felt a pair of eyes burning through me. I just couldn't tell from where. In this moment, my mind was telling me two things. This was either some sick prank, or I was dealing with someone who was sick in the head. Either way, it was just sick. I quieted my breathing and scanned my flashlight around once again. That was when I heard the familiar sound of rocks hitting metal once again from behind me. I almost cried out the word, "Stop!" And to my surprise, it came out more intimidating than I expected. In that moment, I wasn't one of those people who cowers in fear and runs. I was going to continue my search. I ran to where I had heard the sound, searching each row of machines, when I peered around a big cat bulldozer, and standing 30 feet away was another mannequin. But this time it was facing me. This one was more disturbing. It wore a white jacket covered in what I truly hope was fake blood. But the face was what haunts me to this day. It had a very detailed drawing of a man's face, its eyes dripping with blood coming out of its nose, its mouth forming this weird smile I can only describe as pure insanity. For a brief moment, my fear turned to anger. I started to walk towards it, planning on smacking the head of it off with my nightstick, when my anger quickly dissolved back into fear more intense than before. The mannequin's arm moved, and it waved at me. I began to realize this was no mannequin. It was a person. They were wearing a mannequin-like mask to which they added a bunch of horrifying features to. I was frozen in place, and they started taking slow, long steps toward me. I don't even know why I allowed them to take at least 4 steps before I snapped out of it, and my flight response finally kicked in. I turned and ran. I had my keys in my pocket, and my truck was newer with a push to start, so I didn't even need to take them out to turn it on. I heard footsteps in the gravel behind me, chasing me. It didn't matter though. I was already most of the way to my truck. I hopped in, started it, and took off within 10 seconds. I didn't care if I lost my job. It's impossible to understand the gut-wrenching fear unless you felt it firsthand. The red glow of my taillights illuminated not one, but 2 figures moving around behind me. I felt nothing but relief as I tore down that dirt road back to civilization. I'm still kicking myself to this day, but I didn't even think to call the police until the next morning. The adrenaline rush I had the night before had just clouded my vision from doing anything rational. And yes, I did end up losing my job over that incident, unfortunately. The two, maybe more figures I saw had vandalized and robbed the hell out of that place. I didn't get a lot of details on everything they did, but I heard through the grapevine that they spray painted a lot of satanic symbols and messages everywhere, and left bloody handprints on all the windows. It was fake blood, luckily, but it doesn't take from the horror of what they did. As far as I know, they were never caught, and their motives for doing this were unknown. The mannequin I saw was gone as well, but the fact they vandalized and robbed the place was enough for me not to feel guilty about noping out of there when I did. Now I work at a more relaxed and safer job as a lock guy at a car dealership in my hometown, and I haven't had anything like that happen to me since. A few years ago, I worked at a Planet Fitness near my house, before the whole COVID thing. I was, and still am, big into working out, and at the time I was too broke to have a gym membership. So it was a win-win for me, since one of the perks of working there was a free membership. I'm a female, and I'm 26 now. I was 22 when this story takes place. I lived with my parents about a mile away from the gym, which is important to the story. There would be a few shifts I'd work where I'd have to work all night and into the morning. I can't stress enough how awful that shift was. Most Planet Fitnesses that I knew were open 24/7, so occasionally I'd be working the graveyard hours. So it was a Friday, and I was scheduled to work by myself for the night. I don't remember the exact hours it was, but I showed up and it was already dark. Usually, there would only be a couple people working out at a time the entire night, and I would have nothing to do other than clean and sometimes restock the refrigerator if I was lucky. I remember I was just chilling behind the main desk around 2 a.m. when this younger looking guy, probably in his 20s, walks in wearing the skimpiest workout attire I've ever seen a guy wear. He greeted me with a, "Hello, how are you doing tonight?" I just replied something along the lines of, "Oh, just getting through the night." And I remember he just stood leaning against the desk staring at me. I'd never seen this guy before, mainly because there was always the same few people that would work out that late of an hour. After he scanned in, I said, "You're all set, enjoy your workout." And I remember he replied with the most enthusiastic thank you I've ever heard, as if no one had ever said anything polite to him in his life. But after he said thank you, he just continued to stand there, leaning on the desk staring at me. He held the same creepy smile and looked at me as if he were expecting something else. Frantically, I tried to think of a way to get myself out from behind the desk and somewhere he couldn't see me. The level of uncomfortable I was at was the highest anyone at this gym had ever made me, which honestly is saying a lot. I just turned and walked into the back office and pretended to do paperwork. After about 10 minutes, I felt I should go back out to the front desk, and thank God he was gone. I saw him on the other side of the gym using one of the machines. I ended up standing there playing on my phone since I had already done most of the cleaning for the night. I don't remember how long it was, but eventually I noticed the guy was now using the barbells, which were right in front of the desk. He started doing a hip thrust exercise, which is pretty self-explanatory, and I kid you not, this freak turned around and looked at me, and I unfortunately briefly made eye contact with him, and I saw him wink at me. In that moment, I felt I wanted to puke. Although, I was not a confrontational person at all, so instead of telling him not to do that, I just ignored it. Throughout the rest of his workout, I managed not to look at him, but I could see him in my peripherals looking at me the entire time. I eventually had enough, and I went into the women's locker room to clean, and I was planning on staying in there for much longer this time. It had been 2 hours since this dude had showed up, so I figured he must have been almost done. Sure enough, as I came out of the locker room, I did not see him in the gym anymore. I was on edge for the rest of my shift though, but I never saw him again after that. Thankfully, the end of my shift rolled around. I think it was around 5 a.m. when the sun started to come up. I was relieved that I survived without seeing that creepy guy again, and looked forward to heading home and hopping into bed. In the parking lot, I saw 4 cars. Mine, the guy who had just showed up to take over for me, and the one guy that had been on the treadmill. I didn't know who the 4th car belonged to. I had a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach as I started my car, and as I began to pull out of the parking lot, I saw that car's headlights come on and begin to follow me. My heart literally sank into my stomach as it started to race. I was almost positive it was that guy. It got up behind me, but wasn't tailgating me or driving recklessly or anything. The thing is, part of me wanted to think it was pure coincidence and that I wasn't actually being followed. I had been driving for about a minute when my house approached. I didn't want to pull into my driveway right away, so I continued past and planned on taking a bunch of random turns. This guy followed every single turn. By now, I was basically crying. I just wanted to go home, but I couldn't let this dude know where I lived. Then I thought to drive to the police station, which wasn't too far from where I currently was. I prayed that it would work, and that whoever was following me would leave me alone. The thing is, it didn't work. As I pulled into the parking lot, they followed me in. By now, I was shaking. Without thinking, I bolted from my car to the front door of the police station, screaming like a banshee. An officer stepped outside, asking me what was wrong. Through tears, I tried to explain what happened as the car finally turned around and peeled out of the parking lot. I'm so glad this guy was dumb enough to have followed me into the police station, because their security cameras picked up his plate number. They ended up stopping him a few miles down the road, and they gave him a citation for reckless driving, although to my absolute horror, since he hadn't done anything to me, there wasn't anything they were able to do. Shortly thereafter, I quit my job at that Planet Fitness and started working at another one 30 minutes away. The longer drive's kinda sucky, but it's forever worth it if I don't run into that creep again. I'm so thankful he never ended up finding out where I live, because who knows what kind of nightmare I'd be into if he had. So that was a story about how I almost got kidnapped or potentially killed while I was working the night shift at Planet Fitness. I currently work as a cashier at McDonald's. I'm 28, and I grew up around the wrong people, so unfortunately this is how I make my somewhat living. I could get into how the system is corrupt and whatnot, but that's not the subject of the matter in this case. I need every dollar I can get, so I pick up as many shifts as I can. This means I've worked a lot of overnighters. They're not that bad. I get assloads of OT, so at the end of the day, they're worth it. I get asked all the time what kind of characters I run into working at a McDonald's, and I could go on for hours, let me tell you. Most of the time, after 10 p.m., it's just stoned kids with the munchies, and even that can be entertaining. I've had kids literally forget what restaurant they were at halfway through ordering. Funny stuff. Anyways, there was one night I was working till close, which was at midnight. I was on the register, and there were 3 cooks. It was decently slow. Nothing too much was going on. Around 11, I began making my rounds of cleaning up. I began sweeping, taking out the trash, and getting the registers ready for the next day. At 11:30, I remember, a black Nissan Altima pulled into the parking lot. I put my headset back on and groaned as I anticipated some stoned guy trying to order. The McDonald's I work at was recently renovated, so our drive-thrus had the camera pointed at the person ordering. The first thing that struck me as suspicious about this guy was that he was wearing a full COVID mask all the way up past his nose, and a hoodie. Every once in a while, we get those people that still wear masks at all times, so before I judged him, that's all I assumed it was. In a deep, muffled voice, he ordered just a cheeseburger, which, to be honest, was another red flag because very rarely does someone order just one thing. I put in his order, and half a minute later he pulled up to the window. He handed me a $20 bill. I opened the register to get him change, and before I knew it, he had jumped out of his car and was leaning through the window with a gun aimed right at me. He screamed at me to give him the cash in the drawer, which wasn't even that much since I had just cleared all the bills. I gave him the $50 that we kept inside for the morning crew, but he wasn't satisfied. By now, one of the cooks, Bill, had come over to see what was going on, and that was when the guy pointed his gun at him and told him to stay back. He then ordered me to give him more money. I stammered that I had given him everything that I had. He then pointed to the registers in the front and said, "What about that?" I don't know why, but I was reluctant to give him any more money. I did it anyways. Meanwhile, this guy had his gun jammed into the back of my neck the entire time, and he made sure I knew he would have no second thoughts about pulling the trigger if he had to. After I gave him the combined $100 from the front two registers, I told him that was everything in the store that I had access to, and I begged him not to shoot me. He stood there, as if contemplating his next move. After what felt like an eternity of him standing there, he ran back and jumped back through the window and into his car and took off. Bill told me to quickly describe his car and get his plate, as he was currently on the phone with the police. I wasn't able to get his plate, but I described the black Nissan Altima with a big dent in the driver's door. Within minutes, several police officers had arrived. They were able to catch the guy a couple hours later. He was a 43-year-old man named Hector Schlefke, and he was charged with armed robbery. He ended up getting sentenced to 35 years in prison, so thankfully he's off the streets for a long time. I find it crazy that this guy is locked away for stealing $150. Just goes to show you don't ever want to mess around with the law. I seriously debated quitting this job, but with a little persuasion by my boss and a serious raise, I stayed. Nothing remotely close has happened since then when I work nights, and I'd like to keep it that way. Although I always get a twinge of anxiety whenever I see someone come in after dark.